Welcome to the Ultrahuman experience. This session is free for you for the complete experience. Please download the Ultrahuman app.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I live in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, Paris. But today, I'm planning an escape from my city life. I'm heading to a vineyard in Bordeaux, which has produced some of the most delicious French wines for over 2,000 years. I will drink this wine right where it's made, escorted by the charming young man who runs this vineyard. Come join me as I unravel the secrets of this ancient wine. Before we start on this journey, let's check to see if we're ready. Rest your head comfortably on your pillow. Take a long stretch and release any stress from the day. Imagine a city at dawn. The pavements are wet with rain, and the sun is just beginning to spill across the sky. You look up and see an old apartment building before you. A light is on in one of the windows. Through it, you see a young woman getting ready for her day. Curious, you stop, and a moment later, you see her emerge from the apartment building, a suitcase in hand and a spring in her step. You wonder what makes her so happy, and suddenly something shifts, and you can hear the thoughts in her head as she moves down the street. This is what she says. My morning in Paris dawned gray and drizzly, hungover from last night's thunderstorm. I walked its damp streets, feeling as if I was moving through a cloud, stepping lightly over puddles and onto slate sidewalks. The hour was early, but I felt a happy hum of anticipation for the journey ahead. I loved Paris, but was glad to be leaving it for the sea air and warm earth of Bordeaux. My old suitcase was my traveling companion, its leather like browned butter, worn soft and supple from many years of use. The well-oiled strap was a familiar weight on my shoulder as I made my way to the Gare d'Austerlitz. At this hour, the train station was still quiet and not yet crowded. I bought a flaky croissant and a warm café au lait from a cheery red stand on my way to the platform. My train had yet to arrive, and the platform, when I reached it, stood open to the chill and hazy air of the morning. The coffee warmed me as I contemplated the station, just beginning to bustle with morning activity. Like bees in a hive, the station had its own order that ran in neat lines below the high arched ceiling. Trains pulled in and out of the platforms gracefully, and porters pushed suitcase-laden carts with the precision of practiced dancers. I appreciated the rhythm of it all, punctuated periodically by calm, muffled announcements over distant speakers. The giant, ornate clock above, rimmed in gold, chimed the hour as I looked up at it. My train pulled into the station, and I boarded with my suitcase into an empty compartment, taking a seat by the window. The train pulled out of Paris, and I watched as city streets and white stone buildings faded into factories, which thinned out to give way to green fields and country lanes as we sped farther into the countryside. As we approached Bordeaux, we passed several small stone villages, landmarked by ornate Gothic churches and bordered by low, rocky walls. The tracks clacked over busy streams, and we rushed past row after row of deep green vineyards. We pulled into the Bordeaux station after only a few hours, but my own destination lay outside the town, closer to the coast. I hailed a black taxicab, and the driver, an old mustachioed gentleman with a thick Bordeaux accent, ferried me outside the city center. He drove us along country roads until we reached a winding lane with trees arching overhead, sunlight dappling the thick leaves. We pulled up to the secluded address, and I unloaded my suitcase, refusing the cabman's offer of help. The black car trundled back up the lane, and I turned to take my first look at the vineyard. The first thing I noticed was that the air of the vineyard smelled fresh and earthy, with a hint of salt from the not-too-distant sea. I filled my lungs with the deepest breath I had taken in a long time. It had been a blue-gray day in Paris when I had set out, but out here, the sky was clear and the late morning sunny. The vineyard sat on the side of a rolling hill amid craggy cliffs, not too far from the ocean. A wisp of sea breeze tangled my hair. All around me were rows of green, stretching as far as the eye could see, slanting and sloping downwards in neat rows. The leaves of the plants were a deep, established, healthy green. Despite how many there were, they all seemed to have their own space, and they looked loved and nourished. Delicate stakes were set in some places between the rows, with light twine tied to the vines, steadying their rise towards the sun. I noticed that the knots on the twine had been tied gently, and that none of them were held too tightly. Struck by this mass of green rose, it was a moment before I turned to notice the rest of the vineyard. There were a few buildings bordered by a low stone wall, including a squat, friendly, old stone tower, a long barn painted a sea-soaked gray with pale blue shutters, and a small but airy cottage with walls covered in climbing jasmine. As I gazed around, a man came out of the cottage door. He leaned on the porch for a moment and then waved to me. I could tell from a distance that he was smiling, and something about the sight of him filled me with warmth, like the sunlight of the day. "Hello," he called out as he approached, and I had a moment to take him in. He was tall and lean, with a mess of thick, dark hair. He wore a cable-knit navy sweater that looked as soft and worn as my suitcase. The sleeves were hitched up slightly to reveal strong wrists and the big, long-fingered, delicate hands that had doubtless tied the gentle knots I had noticed around the vines. He wore round gold wire glasses and had a slightly crooked smile that made him look younger than he was. It made me want to smile back, and I did. Before I knew it, he had reached the top of the hill where I stood, and he slung my suitcase up onto his shoulder with ease. "Did you have a good journey?" he asked. And I told him about my morning as we walked to the cottage together and deposited my bag inside. Being so close to his lanky frame, I felt flooded with warmth and instantly, effortlessly at ease. I could tell he felt the same from how closely he listened to what I had to say, and our conversation flowed like water. We could have stayed in the warm kitchen of the cottage for hours, talking and laughing about the simplest of things. But then we both remembered why I had come, and he asked eagerly if I wanted to see the vines. I just as eagerly accepted, and we headed out into the lush rose together. As we walked side by side through the swaying grapevines, I enjoyed his closeness and the earthy, musky smell he had, like a rich red wine himself. The vines seemed to love being close to him too, as they reached out to brush against him in a friendly way as we walked. At one point, a long, spiky tendril got caught in my hair. He noticed first, untangling it carefully. As he did, he leaned past me and plucked off a single dusky purple grape from the heart of the plant, perfectly round and taut, like a small, heavy balloon. "For me?" I asked, reaching for it eagerly. He held it out to me solemnly, then pulled back at the last moment and popped it into his own mouth with a gleeful grin. I burst out in a surprised laugh, and he plucked another and offered it to me, eager to make amends. "It's a Cabernet grape, almost fully ripe," he said. My hand brushed against his, warm and steady, as I took the grape from him. He smiled at me in anticipation as I bit into it. The thin skin gave way in my mouth to a deep, rich, sweet juice with a taste like blackberry and honey, and a faintly wild, slightly bitter edge of pollen and black pepper. Eyes wide with delight, I savored the grape, and I could tell that he took pleasure in my frank appreciation. We walked together in the vines as he spoke, and I listened. A spell rose up around me as I listened to him. As if in a daze, I watched him cover young vines to keep them safe and warm, prune back older plants under a hot sun, inhale the sweet ecstasy of a first flowering. He spoke lightly about the hard work with an enthusiasm that made me admire him all the more. We spoke of the grapes and the wines, but more so, I felt the pull of the passage of time, the shift of the seasons, the ebb and flow of the weather, and the interconnectedness of all the life around us. The bees buzzed by, and they were part of the process. The grass buckled underfoot, and each blade was nourished by the same rocky, saline soil that fed the grapes. Distantly, a bird sang. The crickets thrummed, and the wind whipped through the vines, and I absorbed it all in the warm sunlight. Sunk deep within the rose, we reached a low stone wall that bordered a weathered picnic table next to a small summer house. The site was shaded by a sprawling, leafy plane tree, and with the shade and the quickening of the sea breeze here at the edge of the vineyard, I shivered a little. He must have noticed as he pulled off his thick blue sweater and offered it to me before ducking into the summer house. I pulled it on over my head and, caught for a moment inside the soft darkness of the sweater, sank into the faint scent of him that it carried, heady like a spiced winter wine, oaky like rich soil, tangy like the sea. I pushed the two long sleeves up over my elbows as he came out of the summer house, holding 3 dusty bottles of wine and glasses. The bottles were cool to the touch, I noticed, and we sat at the picnic table opposite each other as he uncorked and poured the first wine. As he spoke about the damp winter that the grapes in this particular bottle had weathered, he pushed his gold-rimmed glasses up onto his head animatedly. I noticed that his eyes were the same dark green as the vines. "Try it," he said, smiling at me, and I held up my glass, swirling the deep violet-red liquid around in it. The wine seemed to soak up the orchard light as it lapped up the edges. It was thick, viscous, and as I took a sniff, a heady smell like plum, fig, and peppercorns rose up from the glass. "It's a Merlot," he said. from one of my first years. I sipped the liquid, and it filled up my mouth with jam and campfire smoke, full and sweet and spiced and earthy all at once. It was like the end of a long summer day in a bottle, and I said so. He poured a generous taste of the second bottle, and I admired the colors of the red wines next to each other. Tilting the glasses made them shift in the light, like paint rinsed from a watercolor brush. This next wine was a true red, thinner on the glass. The smell and taste of cherry, oak, and cardamom leapt at me from it, and I nearly gasped at how rich it tasted. Laughing at how much I liked it, he poured me a taste of the third wine from a thin-necked green glass bottle with a hand-written label on it. It was a light, yellowy white wine that, as soon as he uncorked it, filled the space between us with the heady scent of gardenias, lemon, and jasmine. There was a zesty, floral acidity to this one that, when I sipped it, made me purse my lips against the cool, tart freshness. We sat at the table, enjoying the wines in the shade. As we drank from the glasses, the flavors of the wines shifted as they drank in the green sea air, growing more rich, more complex, and silkier. Fat honeybees buzzed past the table as we talked and sipped, and I forgot time was passing at all until I noticed the sun had shifted in the sky, and that it was now well into the afternoon. After we had drunk our fill, we made our way together back up through the vines to the long, light blue and gray barn. The light was even brighter now, and the smell of the earth headier since the day had warmed. When we reached the barn, I looked inside and saw row upon row of heavy oaken barrels sitting together, aging and fermenting years of wine in the shade. I thought we were going inside, but he led me around to the back of the barn, where a large wooden vat stood open to the sun. "What's this?" I asked. In answer, he took my hands and helped me clamber up onto the tall wooden platform to look inside. He vaulted up beside me, and we peered into the vat together. Inside were mounds and mounds of fresh violet and red grapes, ripe, juicy, and ready to burst. He smiled at me mischievously and told me to take off my shoes. We both did, and then he took my hands again. He held my hands easily in his bigger ones, lightly but warmly. His fingers were long, smooth, but with the rough edges of calluses in places from years of caring for the vines. The feel of my hands wrapped up in his filled me with a simple, eager thrill, a lightness in my belly and chest. I took a deep breath in anticipation, and then we stepped together into the wooden vat of grapes. The top layer of grapes burst under the slightest pressure from my feet, the taut skins yielding beneath my toes. As I stepped deeper, I felt the grapes lower down against the grainy wooden barrel, either burst or rearrange themselves to escape the pressure of my stepping feet. I laughed in surprise at the sudden coolness of freshly mashed grapes against my bare skin, and at feeling the hard seed pits slide between my toes. He held my hands tightly so we didn't slip in the slick juices together, which slid up my legs, staining my calves deep violet. Together, we mashed the grapes, finding a rhythm of rising and falling, stepping and slipping slightly together as the smell of honey and wine rose in the air around us. We mashed most of the grapes down into a pulp until it was warm enough I could pull off the thick sweater he had lent me. We climbed out of the wooden tub together and wiped our feet down with worn, soft towels left under the step for that purpose. We didn't bother to put our shoes back on, since the day was warm and the grass that led back to the cottage was soft and lush. I was hungry, and he offered to find us something to eat. I followed him inside the cottage and found myself in the whitewashed kitchen with blue patterned tile above the stove and a well-worn wooden table. He piled up options onto the table for me to choose from. I settled on a crispy baguette, warm from sitting in the midday sun. A few cheeses, soft and smooth, some almonds, and a jam he had made from wild blackberries. I peered inside the pantry and found another bottle of wine to taste, cool in a dark green bottle with another hand-scrawled label. We started at the table, but the late afternoon sunlight beckoned, and halfway through our meal, we scooped up the rest and headed outside. I swung the bottle giddily as we walked, and he pointed out landmarks we had missed before, using the end of the baguette as a pointer. We passed the first row of vines he had planted, a spot in the stone wall he had carved his initials into as a boy, a slim tree still recovering from a lightning strike during a summer storm. I teased him as we walked, entirely at ease in the late sun, and he tapped me playfully on the shoulder with the baguette. We arrived with our treasures, back at the picnic table, deep in the vines, by the stone wall to the sea. And there we ate our fill. This time, I uncorked the wine to taste, and he watched me with pride as I poured it smoothly into our glasses and swirled it in the cooling air. The pale yellow in my glass was a faded gold, like the early evening light around me. The wine lingered on my tongue as I drank, clear, crisp, lemony, and buttery. Sitting across from each other at the old picnic table, our hands lingered together over the wine bottle and the last of the bread. Despite all the wine we had drunk, my heart was lighter than my head, and we couldn't seem to run out of things to talk about. I felt the stretch in my lower back as we leaned in closely over the weather-beaten table. And when he threw his head back to laugh at something I said, I admired the sharp line of his jaw, the ruffle of his thick, dark hair, and the easy width of his shoulders. We were only roused from the spell of each other's conversation by the fading light. The clear chill of twilight had crept in quietly, urging us to stand up from the picnic table. We left the empty bottle in the summer house and wandered off together on an undiscovered path sheltered in the vines. Giddy from the wine and the ease of each other's company, he chased me playfully up one row of vines, pulling me under his arm as he caught me. I leaned into his chest, breathing in deeply, smelling the musk of him, like I was inhaling a precious wine before tasting it. As night fell, we wound our way back to the low stone wall that ran between the cozy cottage and the leafy expanse of the vines. The breeze from the sea, far below, carried a faint tang of salt air all the way back up to us by the house. We sat on the stone wall, side by side, and looked out onto the vineyard below, dusky in the dimming light. We stayed out there as night rose up around us and the stars came out above like a glistening net cast by a fisherman on a smooth, dark sea. There were more stars out here than I was used to seeing over the streetlights of Paris, and he knew them all. I leaned against his warm, strong frame and felt the slight vibration of his chest as he pointed up to each constellation and told its story, ancient and beautiful in his low, steady voice. We stayed like that until we had exhausted all of the stars within sight. We lapsed into sweet, easy quiet together in the clear, cold evening air. We breathed together in the earthy richness of the grapevines, listened to the ebb and flow of the distant sea, and watched the full moon rise high above, bright in the inky blue-black sky. My eyelids grow heavy, and I feel a yawn coming on. I close my eyes, feeling content with my day. I can feel myself drifting in and out of sleep. I don't fight it. I invite it. It's time for me to relive this day in my dreams once again. Good night.